Have you ever stopped to think about why you can't disconnect, even when everything around you calls for a break? Imagine the scene. It's late at night, you're tired, but you pick up your cell phone for one more, just a minute. Notifications start popping up. You click on one, then another, and without realizing it, 2 hours have passed. You feel like time has been wasted, but deep down, that feeling of momentary satisfaction seems to fill a void, doesn't it? Now think, what is really happening? Are you in control of your time and your choices, or are you simply being carried by an invisible current that pulls you with each new stimulus? The answer, although difficult to accept, is simple. You are trapped in an invisible web of instant pleasure, carefully woven by modern society. And the worst thing is that you don't even realize it. You, like all of us, have been conditioned to seek immediate pleasure but never truly achieve it. This incessant search for quick gratification makes us feel as if we are living the best time of our lives. But deep down, the feeling of accomplishment always seems to slip through our fingers, like sand. The problem is not the pleasure itself, but how it has been transformed into an addiction disguised as freedom. The moment you click to watch one more video, buy one more thing, or respond to one last message, you are no longer choosing. You are being consumed by a system that feeds your needs with the one thing you want most: immediate pleasure. But what's behind this insatiable search for quick pleasure? Is this feeling of freedom that we have when consuming whatever we want just an illusion? The answer lies in something that Aldous Huxley already predicted, almost a century ago, in his visionary work. He anticipated that, in the not-so-distant future, control over humanity would come not through repression, but through distraction. And unfortunately, that future is no longer a prediction. It is a reality that we are living. Imagine a world where no one needs to be forced to obey, where there is no censorship because no one cares to question, where people get so distracted that they simply stop thinking critically. Does it seem like a distant scenario? Because this is exactly the world we live in today. In 1932, Aldous Huxley launched Brave New World, a book that seemed like absurd fiction at the time. Unlike other dystopias that portrayed oppressive, totalitarian governments, his vision was even scarier. He described a future where people would not be controlled by pain, but by pleasure, where freedom would not be forcibly taken away, but willingly exchanged for uninterrupted distractions. And now, almost 100 years later, that prediction has come true. The modern control system is no longer based on chains or threats. He uses a much more subtle and effective method: the seduction of immediate pleasure. We are surrounded by stimuli designed to hold our attention and prevent us from stopping to think. Social networks, apps, fast entertainment. Everything is carefully planned to keep us distracted. And the more time we spend consuming these momentary pleasures, the less time we have to question, reflect, and change our own reality. The most impressive thing is that this is not a conspiracy theory. It's a proven fact. Psychologist B.F. Skinner, in his operant conditioning experiments in the 1950s, showed that the human brain can be trained to repeat behaviors that offer quick rewards. Now think about the notifications on your cell phone. Every like, every new message, every recommended video is a small reward that keeps you engaged. This is no coincidence. Tech companies invest billions in research to make their products addictive and maximize the time you spend on them. Tristan Harris himself, a former Google designer and digital ethicist, revealed that social networks are designed to manipulate our neurological system. He explains that each infinite scroll of the screen, each new suggested video, each optimized algorithm has a single objective: to capture and hold your attention for as long as possible. That's why, even when you don't want to, you feel the need to check your phone every few minutes. You are not simply browsing, you are being controlled. And it's not just technology. The food industry does the same by creating products that stimulate pleasure receptors in the brain, making processed foods irresistible. In 2020, a study published in British Medical Journal showed that more than 60% of calories consumed in industrialized countries come from ultra-processed foods, full of sugar, fat, and ingredients that make it impossible to eat just one piece. This doesn't happen by chance. These products are designed to be consumed compulsively. Now, put it all together: addictive foods, social networks that capture your attention, fast-paced entertainment that distracts you from reality. What we have is a system where people become dependent on instant pleasure, without realizing that in the end, they are giving up their own freedom. Not because someone forced them, but because they were trained to only desire what is easy, quick, and pleasurable. The most ironic? The more we seek these instant rewards, the emptier we feel. And that's where true control lies. A person who is constantly entertained, consuming stimuli without stopping, loses the ability to realize that they are being manipulated. The world no longer needs dictatorships to keep people obedient. Just give them everything they want, until they are so satisfied that they lose the desire to question. Have you ever felt bored, even after spending hours browsing social media, or watching videos and consuming content incessantly? Have you ever noticed how, at the end of the day, after consuming so much, you still feel empty inside, as if something is missing? This emptiness is a reflection of something profound that we are neglecting: the inability to feel real pleasure in a world saturated with fleeting pleasures. In today's world, we are constantly looking for quick stimuli, and this comes at a cost that many don't immediately realize. When we only seek instant gratification, whether through delicious food, social media, or online shopping, we are only filling a temporary space, a space that, instead of bringing lasting satisfaction, makes the void even greater. This phenomenon is not new. Philosophers and psychologists since ancient times have discussed the human search for meaning and satisfaction. Friedrich Nietzsche, a thinker who spent much of his life reflecting on the existential void, spoke of the death of God and human beings' search for new values in a world without absolute certainties. According to him, without a clear purpose, people run the risk of getting lost in empty pursuits such as immediate pleasure. Nowadays, this search for immediate pleasure replaces what could be a deeper journey of self-knowledge, growth, and reflection. The problem is that this pleasure not only prevents us from pursuing something more meaningful, it also weakens our ability to engage with the world authentically. It creates a vicious cycle. The feeling of momentary pleasure makes us want more, but when the pleasure ends, the emptiness returns with more intensity. Psychology explains this as a failure to build a true connection with what is essential and lasting.
What we feel is an emotional hunger, an unmet need for something that fills our being completely. However, immediate pleasure does not offer this depth. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and creator of logotherapy, argued that the main motivating force of human beings is not the search for pleasure, but the search for a purpose.
According to Frankl, existential emptiness occurs when we cannot find that purpose, and, instead, we surrender to the unsustainable search for momentary satisfaction. This happens because when we pursue immediate pleasures, such as spending hours on social media or consuming food products that give us a quick feeling of pleasure, we are, in fact, postponing the search for something more meaningful. The problem is not the pleasure itself, but the fact that it is constantly renewed and never provides us with a feeling of enoughness. Unlike deep pleasure, which requires effort and sacrifice, fleeting pleasure doesn't let us feel like we've reached a point of true fulfillment. Now imagine the impact of this on our personal relationships and at work. When the pursuit of easy pleasure becomes the focus of our lives, the effort required to build deep relationships or achieve larger, lasting goals becomes irritating, difficult, or unnecessary. Feeling disconnected, whether from other people or even from our own emotions, becomes more common. Relationships become superficial, as no one wants to invest time and effort in the complexities that a real relationship requires. Likewise, long-term projects and goals, which require discipline, patience, and effort, are easily abandoned in search of quick rewards. In 2022, research published in Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology indicated that excessive use of social networks is directly linked to increased feelings of depression and loneliness. When people engage in constant comparisons with others, they end up feeling that their lives are empty and meaningless. The paradox is clear. The more we look for immediate pleasure, the more we realize that it doesn't fill the hole we feel. And the more we seek this superficial filling, the more the void expands. So what are we left with? The solution is not to eliminate the pleasures that life offers, but to learn to choose what really brings deep and lasting satisfaction. There is nothing wrong with seeking a moment of pleasure, but we need to be aware that true fulfillment comes when we face life's challenges, when we dedicate ourselves to something greater than ourselves, and when we invest in developing our personal capabilities. Therefore, instead of running away from emptiness, We can learn to accept it and use it as a guide to find what really matters. Emptiness is not an enemy. It's a sign that we're looking for something worthwhile. And by recognizing this, we can finally fill that space with something that, unlike fleeting pleasure, brings a real sense of fulfillment and meaning. Nowadays, it is difficult to imagine life without the constant presence of stimuli around us. The sound of a cell phone vibrating, the need to check social media every moment, and the compulsion to consume online content are just a few examples of how we have become dependent on quick and easy pleasures. The question is this constant search for instant gratification just a reflection of the desire for pleasure, or is it something deeper, an addiction that we are feeding without realizing it? Addiction, in essence, is repeated behavior that we cannot control, even though we know it has negative consequences. In the case of the search for immediate pleasure, this dependence is fueled by a continuous cycle of dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for sensations of pleasure and reward. Every time we do something pleasurable, our brain releases dopamine, which creates a feeling of satisfaction. But when this feeling subsides, the desire for more reward leads us to seek pleasure again, in an endless cycle. This process, which works well for natural behaviors like eating or sleeping, becomes problematic when it starts to apply to excessive consumption of technology, highly processed foods, or online shopping. In 2020, research carried out by Harvard University showed that 80% of young adults stated that they felt the need to check their social networks immediately after waking up, which demonstrates how these platforms have become essential in our routine, often with the same level of dependence on an addictive substance. This compulsion for momentary pleasure is not a coincidence. Social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram use algorithms designed to capture our attention in unsustainable ways. Each like, each comment, each notification becomes a form of instant reward that keeps us more and more hooked. This meticulous construction of social networks and other applications aims to make us dependent without us realizing it. The problem with dependence on quick gratification is that it ends up taking the place of deeper pleasures, those that really contribute to our well-being. Instead of seeking true human connections, we settle for the superficial validation of likes and comments. Instead of facing challenges and striving for something meaningful, we prefer the immediate sensation of a funny video or an online purchase that brings us joy for just a few minutes. Addiction is not limited to technology or food consumption, but is also reflected in our emotional lives. Relationships, for example, can be affected by this search for instant pleasure. Rather than investing time and energy into building deep bonds, many prefer the ease of quick, superficial interactions like texting or quick calls. This creates a cycle of dissatisfaction, where even surrounded by interactions, we feel more empty and disconnected. This behavior is not just inconvenient, it can be devastating. Neurologist Dr. David J. Linden, author of the book The Compass of Pleasure, explains that this type of addictive behavior reconfigures the brain in such a way that it becomes increasingly resistant to simple stimuli and more demanding for more intense stimuli. In other words, the pleasure that was previously found in simple moments in life is no longer enough. This is what leads to the constant desire for more videos, more shopping, more food, more validation. And the more we seek, the further we move away from what could really provide us with true and lasting happiness. Furthermore, like any addiction, the constant search for immediate pleasure diminishes our ability to make important long-term decisions. Our ability to delay gratification diminishes, which prevents us from achieving larger goals, such as professional success or building healthy relationships. Instead, we settle for what is easy, accessible, and immediate, even if, in the long run, this leaves us more dissatisfied and frustrated. So, the question remains, how can we break this cycle? The first step is to recognize that we are stuck in a pattern of behavior that, although comfortable at the moment, is not getting us anywhere. An addiction to instant gratification is like an invisible prison that limits our ability to live a full, meaningful life. And like all addictions, it requires effort to overcome. But by making the decision to disconnect and begin seeking fulfillment from deeper, more lasting sources, we can begin to restore the freedom we lost along the way. This transformation will not happen overnight, but with patience, discipline, and self-control, we can free ourselves from dependence on fleeting pleasures and finally find true happiness. We live in a world where freedom of choice seems to be one of the greatest assets we have. The ability to decide what to do, what to consume, what to wear, who to interact with. All of this gives us the impression of absolute control over our lives. However, there is a hidden paradox behind this feeling of freedom. When all options are within our reach, do we become freer or, in fact, more imprisoned? It seems contradictory, but that's exactly what happens. The abundance of choices, far from giving us greater control over our existence, has the opposite effect. It traps us, like this, simply because by surrounding ourselves with infinite options for immediate pleasure, we are losing our ability to make conscious and profound choices. What once seemed like freedom is now a vicious cycle in which what we consume becomes a trap. This is not something new. Aldous Huxley, in his work Brave New World, had already anticipated that true servitude would not come from direct oppression, but from false pleasure. And this control would not need to be imposed by an external force. It would be society itself, with its irresistible offers, that would create an invisible prison, where people would be slaves to their own desires and impulses. Today, in the 21st century, society seems to have reached this point. We are surrounded by technologies, products, and media that offer us endless pleasure. Whether on social media, where we are bombarded by constant updates, online shopping, which promises instant satisfaction, or even the unrestrained consumption of entertainment, all of this fuels an uncontrollable desire for more. And while all of these options may seem like freedom, they actually imprison us by depriving us of the ability to slow down and reflect. The data proves this reality. The average time people spend on their smartphones has grown alarmingly. According to a 2021 study by the company Digital Information World, smartphone users spend on average 3.5 hours a day in applications. And, according to research carried out by American Psychological Association, 70% to adults stated that social media makes them feel more anxious and less satisfied with their lives. This shows how the abundance of options, far from freeing us, is making us increasingly dependent and discontented. The real problem here is that by always looking for something new and exciting, we miss what really matters. We are so busy scrolling social media or consuming the latest news that we fail to connect with the people around us, with our deepest emotions, and with what truly brings meaning to life. The idea that freedom is the multiplicity of choices is a fallacy. True freedom does not come from the number of options, but from the ability to choose what really matters. Of course, to some extent, the ability to choose between different paths, products, or experiences is a form of freedom. But the freedom that truly empowers us is not in being overwhelmed by options, but in being able to make conscious choices that are aligned with our values and long-term goals. In a society full of distractions, constant offers, and stimuli, true freedom begins the moment we take control over what we consume, what affects us, and what we choose to do with our time and energy. True power lies in the ability to say no to what distracts us, what traps us in a cycle of quick gratification, and in saying yes to what allows us to grow, learn, and live a fulfilling life. By recognizing that true freedom lies not in unlimited choice, but in the ability to choose what truly matters, we can begin to escape the prison that modern society has built for us. And in doing so, we take back control of our lives, not because we have more options, but because we learn to choose better. Now that you've reflected on how the incessant search for instant pleasure has shaped our everyday lives, a crucial question arises: how to break out of this vicious cycle? How can we regain control over our mind and our choices when everything around us seems to be screaming for our attention? The answer, although simple, is challenging. Recognize that the problem is not the pleasure, but the way we are dealing with it. Pleasure is not the enemy. The enemy is the dependence we create on it. The real challenge is not in running away from what brings us momentary satisfaction, but in learning to use pleasure consciously, without it enslaving us. Modern society has taught us to seek immediate pleasure as a quick solution to emptiness. But this path leads us to an abyss where satisfaction is never full and the meaning of life is lost. But there is a way out. True freedom comes from the ability to decide when to seek pleasure and when to make sacrifices in the name of something greater. When we learn to delay gratification, tolerate discomfort, and focus on what really matters, we begin to regain our autonomy. This is the invitation I leave you now. Stop for a moment and ask yourself, who is in control of my life? Is it you, or is it the incessant search for quick and easy stimuli? If the answer isn't you, then it's time to take the first step in the right direction. Start questioning what consumes your mind and attention. Realize that every choice you make can be an opportunity to free yourself or imprison yourself even more. True change begins when we decide that we will no longer be governed by the vices of immediate pleasure, but that we will be masters of our own will. When this happens, pleasure stops being a prison and becomes what it should always be, a reward, not a necessity. And when you regain that control, you will finally be free to live a life that has purpose, is built on conscious choices, and is truly fulfilling. The question now is, are you ready to make this change? Because if the answer is yes, the power to transform your life is already in your hands.